80% of China's oil imports are forced through a passage less than 2 miles wide that the United States Navy patrols every single day. You heard that right. The entire energy supply of the second largest economy on Earth squeezes through a strip of water narrower than the length of Central Park, surrounded by nations inside America's sphere of influence. And that is just the beginning. Because if you want to understand how a single country quietly engineered its way out of the most dangerous choke point in the modern world, hit a quick like and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. By the end of this video, you are going to understand exactly how China spent $7 billion to make America's biggest geopolitical lever structurally irrelevant, one pipeline at a time. The 2-mile noose. Walk over to a map of Southeast Asia and put your finger on the thin sliver of water between Malaysia and the Indonesian island of Sumatra. That sliver has a name: the Strait of Malacca. At its narrowest point, it is less than 2 miles wide. Picture the distance from one end of New York Central Park to the other, and you are roughly there. Now picture this. Around a quarter of all the goods traded on the planet pass through that narrow stretch of sea every year. Tankers, container ships, bulk carriers, lined up nose to tail like cars on a freeway that never sleeps. But for one country in particular, this is not just a busy shipping lane, it is the artery. It is the single piece of geography the entire economy depends on. That country is China, and here is the number that should stop you cold. China imports more than 10 million barrels of crude oil every single day. To picture that, imagine an Olympic swimming pool. Now imagine filling 600 of them with crude oil every 24 hours. That is the daily appetite of Chinese industry. Factories, power plants, trucks, cars, shipping, aviation, all of it runs on that flow. And close to 80% of those barrels are forced to sail through the Strait of Malacca on their way home. Here is the part that most people never think about. China does not control that strait, not a single mile of it. The waterway is bordered by Malaysia, Singapore, and Indonesia, 3 countries with deep economic and security ties to the United States. Singapore alone hosts a major American naval presence. The 7th Fleet patrols those waters as a matter of routine. The skies above are watched by aircraft based at facilities Washington either owns or has access to through long-standing arrangements with regional allies. Think of it like this. Imagine your entire household. Your heating, your cooking, your hot water, your lights runs on fuel delivered by a single pipe. And the only valve on that pipe sits in your neighbor's garage. On a normal day, your neighbor is friendly. He waves at you when you take the trash out. But you have had arguments. Some of them serious. And every time you raise your voice, you are aware that the valve is not in your hand, it is in his. That is the Malacca dilemma. It is not a phrase invented by Western analysts. It was coined inside China itself by Chinese leadership more than 2 decades ago. They named the problem because they could see it clearly. In any serious confrontation over Taiwan, over the South China Sea, over trade, Washington holds a theoretical switch. A blockade of the strait would not need to be total. It would not need to last months. Even the credible threat of interdiction would be enough to spike global insurance rates, scare tanker operators away, and choke the flow within days. Here is the brutal catch. China is the world's 2nd largest economy, the largest manufacturing base on the planet, and a rising military power. But for 2 decades, its energy security rested on a strip of water it does not own, cannot patrol, and cannot defend. Every barrel of Saudi crude, every shipment from Angola, from Iran, from the Gulf, all of it had to thread that needle. For most countries, that would be a permanent fact of life. Geography is geography. You accept it. You build your foreign policy around it. You try to make friends with the people who hold the valve. China made a different choice. China decided to walk away from the ocean. But walking away from the ocean is one thing on a whiteboard. Doing it across hundreds of miles of jungle, mountains, and one of the most politically volatile countries on the planet is something else entirely. The decision to leave the ocean. Put yourself in a Beijing planning room in the early 2000s. You have a map on the wall. You have the Malacca problem circled in red. And you have a choice to make. The obvious answer is the loud one. Build a bigger navy. Build aircraft carriers. Build a blue water fleet that can escort tankers through hostile water. That is the answer most great powers in history have reached for. The British did it. The Americans did. If your shipping lane is vulnerable, you protect it with steel and gunpowder. China started down that road. The Navy expanded. New ships were laid down at a pace that startled Western analysts. But here is the part that puts everything into perspective. Even a much larger Chinese fleet would not solve the actual problem, because the problem was not the absence of Chinese ships. The problem was the presence of American ones. And the Americans had a 60-year head start. They had bases. They had alliances. They had the 7th Fleet operating out of Japan, the 5th Fleet out of Bahrain, and a ring of partner nations stretching from South Korea down to Australia. Catching up at sea was a 30-year project. The Malacca dilemma was a today problem. So Beijing reached for a second answer. Diplomacy, buy access, sign long-term deals with the countries that border the strait, cultivate friendly relations with Malaysia, Indonesia, Singapore. Invest in their economies. Make yourself too valuable to blockade. That worked, up to a point. But here is what most people get wrong about diplomacy as security. A friend today can be a neutral tomorrow, and a hostile Coast Guard the day after that. Governments change. Pressure from Washington is real. You cannot bet the energy supply of 1.4 billion people on the goodwill of 3 foreign capitals. Then somebody in that planning room asked a different question, a quieter one. What if you simply did not use the strait at all? Not for everything, but for some of it. What if you took a piece of your oil supply and routed it through land instead of water? Think of it like a household with one front door. For decades, every delivery, groceries, packages, mail, fuel comes through that door. And one day you realize the door is on a street your neighbor controls. You cannot move the house, you cannot move the street. But you can cut a side door into the back wall. It is smaller. It will not handle every delivery. But once it exists, the front door is no longer the only way in, and the leverage your neighbor holds quietly drops. That is what China decided to do, cut a side door. The route they picked was extraordinary on a map. Tankers from the Middle East would no longer need to sail all the way past India, across the Bay of Bengal, down through the strait, up the entire eastern coast of China, and finally into a refinery on the Pacific. Instead, they would stop on the western coast of Myanmar, at a port called Chokepoint on the Bay of Bengal. From there, the oil would travel overland, through Myanmar, across the border, directly into China's southwest interior, into Yunnan province. Look at the geography and the elegance hits you. The new route shaves roughly 1,900 miles off the tanker journey. To anchor that is the distance from New York to Denver. Gone, vanished. The oil now arrives inland, far from any American naval presence, in a part of China that for most of history has been the hardest to supply. Here is the part that most analysts underestimated at the time. This was not a quick fix. This was not a stopgap. This was Beijing deciding, very deliberately, that the ocean was not the only way home. That a barrel of crude could travel through a mountain just as well as it could travel through a strait. And that if you built the route well enough, and you defended it well enough, the leverage that came with controlling the strait would slowly bleed away. But picking the route was the easy part. Drawing a line on a map takes an afternoon. Building a pipeline across Myanmar that took an army. Building across Myanmar. Now picture the ground itself. You are not building a pipeline across the Midwest. You are not laying steel across a Saudi desert. You are cutting a path across one of the most difficult stretches of terrain anywhere on the Asian continent. Myanmar is roughly the size of Texas, but unlike Texas, most of it is not flat. The western coast, where the pipeline starts, is hot, wet, and tropical. The interior climbs into highlands, then mountains, then more mountains. Dense forest covers vast stretches of the route. Rivers cut across the path in every direction. And the country itself has been through decades of internal conflict, with armed groups controlling territory that no central government has fully governed in living memory. This is the ground China decided to lay almost 500 miles of dual pipeline across. 500 miles is the distance from Boston to Washington, D.C. Now imagine carving that distance through jungle and mountain instead of along a highway. And here is the detail most people skip over. The crews could not just show up with pipe. There were no roads. In huge stretches of the route, there was nothing. No access points, no staging areas. No way to move heavy equipment to the spot where the pipe needed to go. So before a single section of steel could be laid, the workers had to build the road T to reach the spot where they would lay it. Hundreds of miles of access roads, cut by hand and machined through forest that had never been mapped at engineering resolution. Think of it like this. Imagine you want to build a fence at the far end of your property, but your property is the size of a small country. And between your back door and the fence line, there is no path, no clearing, no way to drive a truck. So before you can plant a single post, you have to build the driveway, the whole driveway. Across every hill and stream between you and the spot where the fence is going. That is what crews faced across Myanmar, just at a vastly larger scale. Then came the engineering itself. A pipeline is not just a long tube. Oil and gas do not flow downhill on their own across mountain ranges. The system needs pumping stations to push crude oil along the route. It needs compressor stations to keep natural gas pressurized. It needs monitoring systems every few miles to watch the pressure, watch the flow, watch for leaks. It needs storage terminals at the entry and exit points, and every one of those components has to function reliably in conditions that swing from tropical coastal humidity to cold highland air. Here is what makes this genuinely impressive. The total system, once you count the Myanmar section plus the Chinese extensions inland, runs over 1,500 miles. 1,500 miles is roughly the distance from Los Angeles to Chicago. And along that entire length, the pressure has to stay stable, the temperature differentials have to be managed, and the flow has to remain predictable enough that refineries in southwest China can plan their operations weeks in advance. There are actually two pipelines running side by side along most of the route. One carries crude oil, the other carries natural gas. They were built in parallel because building one without the other would have been a wasted opportunity. Once you have the right-of-way, once you have the access roads, once you have the political agreements with Myanmar, you do not lay one pipe, you lay two. But here is the part nobody talks about. The hardest engineering on this project was not the steel or the pumps. It was the political ground underneath the steel. The route passes through regions of Myanmar where the central government's writ does not fully run. Ethnic armed groups operate in stretches of the path. Securing the line physically, day after day, year after year, required arrangements that no public engineering report fully describes. Local accommodations, local payments, local agreements. End quote. The pipeline is not just a feat of construction, it is a feat of operating in a country that has never been fully stable. By the time the first section was welded shut and the last pumping station came online, China had built something that did not exist on any map a decade earlier. A pathway from the Bay of Bengal directly into the soft underbelly of its own interior, a route that no aircraft carrier could blockade, a line of steel that quietly rerouted the geography of Asian energy. And then somebody opened the valve. The day the first barrel arrived, tightened. Walk down to the western coast of Myanmar with me. The port is called Chokepoint. For most of its history, it was a quiet fishing town on the Bay of Bengal. Then the cranes arrived, then the storage tanks. Then the deep water berths, capable of receiving the largest crude carriers in the world. And one day, a tanker from the Middle East dropped anchor offshore and began pumping its cargo into a pipeline instead of a ship continuing east. That moment is the one most people miss. On the surface, nothing about it looked dramatic. No headlines, just a tanker, a pump, and a steel tube heading inland. But the geography of Asian energy quietly shifted the day that pumps started running. Here is the operational reality. The crude line carries roughly 440,000 barrels of oil every single day. To anchor that is enough crude to fuel the daily transport needs of a mid-sized European country. The natural gas line running alongside it carries around 12 billion cubic meters a year. 12 billion cubic meters is enough gas to heat several million homes through a full winter. Here is the part that puts everything into perspective. Before this pipeline existed, a barrel of Saudi crude bound for a refinery in Yunnan province had to travel an almost absurd route out of the Persian Gulf, past India, through the Strait of Malacca, up the South China Sea, around the entire eastern seaboard, into a Pacific port, then back across China by rail to reach the southwest. Now the same barrel sails into Chokepoint, walks across Myanmar in steel, and arrives in Kunming, having never entered the South China Sea. The tanker journey is shorter by roughly 1,900 miles. The American naval presence along the new path is essentially zero. Think about what that does to the chessboard. Before the pipeline, every refinery in southwest China was a Pacific customer. It had to be fed by sea. After the pipeline, a significant slice of that demand becomes an Indian Ocean customer. The oil never sails past Singapore. It never passes a single 7th Fleet patrol. If that operational shift surprised you, the next part is going to be even harder to believe. Hit subscribe so you are there when we get to it. Now here is the detail engineers don't want to admit out loud. A pipeline is more vulnerable in some ways than a ship at sea. A tanker can change course. It can take a longer route around a problem. A pipeline cannot. Once you commit the route is the route. If a section is damaged, the flow stops at that point. You cannot reroute steel. So China did not build the pipeline to replace tanker traffic through Malacca. That was never the goal. It built the pipeline to make sure tanker traffic through Malacca was no longer the only way oil reached the country. Different problem, different answer. China did not announce that the Malacca dilemma had been solved. China simply opened a valve in Yunnan province and started receiving oil from a direction it had never received oil from before. The map was redrawn without a single press conference. But the Myanmar pipeline was never meant to be the whole answer. It was meant to be the first one. The pipeline was never the plan. It was the opening move. Now zoom out, because the Myanmar line is one door. China has been quietly cutting others. Look north. The Central Asia gas corridor runs through Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and Kazakhstan, delivering 55 billion cubic meters of gas a year into western China. To anchor that, 55 billion cubic meters is roughly the annual gas consumption of a country the size of Italy. A new expansion called Line D is targeting over 80 billion. Alongside it runs a crude oil pipeline from Kazakhstan that stretches nearly 1,400 miles overland. 1,400 miles is the distance from Chicago to Miami, in pipe. Look further north. The Power of Siberia pipeline carries gas from Russia across nearly 1,900 miles of taiga and permafrost. Power of Siberia 2 is on the drawing board to add another 50 billion cubic meters on top. Look west. The Gwadar Port development in Pakistan offers a future Arabian Sea outlet that could one day feed oil over the Karakoram Mountains directly into western China, a route shorter than going through Malacca by thousands of miles. Here's what most people get wrong about all of this. They look at each pipeline as a separate project. It is not. China has built a domestic network of roughly 60,000 miles of internal pipeline, tying every entry point together. 60,000 miles is more than twice the circumference of the Earth, all sitting inside one country. Think of it like a household with 6 different doors instead of 1. Block any one of them and the deliveries still arrive through the others. That is the system China has spent 20 years building. Myanmar was just the first door cut into the wall. But here's the catch nobody talks about, and it is the part of this story that the cheerleaders leave out. The catch nobody talks about. Watch this next part carefully. The Myanmar pipeline, despite its engineering brilliance, accounts for less than 5% of China's total oil imports. You heard that right. After $7 billion, after almost 500 miles of pipeline, after years of construction across one of the hardest stretches of ground on the continent, the answer is a single-digit slice of the problem. Here is the brutal catch. The pipeline runs through a country in active civil conflict. Since the 2021 coup, Myanmar has fractured. Ethnic armed groups control growing stretches of territory. Sections of the pipeline route now sit inside zones where the central government has lost effective control. Attacks on infrastructure have already happened in the country. The flow has held so far. But the political ground underneath the steel is shakier today than it was the day the valve first opened. And here is what most people get wrong about pipelines as a security solution. A tanker can change course. A pipeline cannot. China traded one vulnerability for another. The new one is smaller. It is further from American naval reach, but it is fixed in place, and it runs through somebody else's war. So why do it? Why build a route that solves less than 5% of the problem in a country this unstable at this cost? Because the answer was never about the Myanmar pipeline alone. The answer is what the Myanmar pipeline, multiplied 6 times over, quietly does to a choke point that the entire post-war American order in Asia was built on. The choke point that no longer chokes. Here is the reframe that changes how you see the whole story. China is not trying to replace the Strait of Malacca. That was never the point. China is making sure the Strait of Malacca is no longer the only door. Think of it like a lock on the front of a house. The lock is real. The lock works. But if the house has 5 other doors, the lock has lost its meaning. It is still there. It still turns. But it no longer decides whether anybody gets inside. That is what 20 years of patient pipeline building has done. The strait is still narrow. The 7th Fleet still patrols it. America still holds the theoretical switch. But the switch now controls a smaller and smaller share of what flows into China. Myanmar took a slice. Central Asia took another. Kazakhstan took another. Russia took another. Gwadar is being prepared to take more. And the domestic network ties every one of those slices into a single redirectable system. America built its entire Asia-Pacific energy strategy around a choke point. China spent 20 years engineering its way around that choke point, one pipeline at a time. The lock is still on the door. The door just isn't the only way in anymore. If this changed how you think about energy and power, hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Now, I want to hear from you in the comments. Does America still hold the leverage at Malacca, or has China already quietly taken it away?